Hi, Misha here, and we revisited the TIE Fighters around Thanksgiving, so around Christmas I thought we would revisit the Starfighters of the Rebel Alliance. And we've already looked at the cruisers. These typically operated from the Mon Cows, but because of their design and what they were capable of, they could operate from planet side or space stations or pretty much anywhere. Much more flexible and a different philosophy compared with the Empire. So we'll talk about Y-Wings, X-Wings, A-Wings, B-Wings, and more, and kind of cover from the end of the Clone Wars up through the New Republic era. Let's just dive on in. So the general tactics used, they would launch from either a base or a carrier ship, go into hyperdrive. They all have FTL capability, strike a target, and retreat back into hyperspace. And they all have shielding, and the Rebellion only had a few of each one, at least compared to the numbers of TIEs the Empire had, meaning that they relied on the skills of their pilots and the craftiness of their technicians to keep these all running. So whereas the TIEs are all pretty uniform, these are made by different places over different periods, and sometimes with some of them they only had a handful, others they had larger numbers of, but never enough. So with that, let's begin with one of the oldest ships in the fleet, the Y-Wing. The BTL A4, designed and manufactured by Commentaries, commonly known as the Y-Wing, although sometimes called the Wishbone. This design, at least in principle, does date back to the Clone Wars, where it was known as the BTL-B. It was a two-seat assault bomber, heavily armed and armored, but not necessarily that maneuverable and not terribly fast. But that was in the Clone Wars, and it was actually quite a good ship during that period. But the Empire wasn't really interested in continuing it because it had a Class 2 hyperdrive, required a crew of 2, 1 in a turret, and it just didn't really fit their whole aesthetic. So many were scheduled to be scrapped, some were given to planetary defense units in the Outer Rim. Either way, they were stolen or otherwise kind of purchased on the black market by the nascent rebels. And the BTL A4 was a variant meant to be a single-seater that Commentaries had developed towards the end of the Clone War that the Empire passed on. And the stories get a little muddled, but either way, they turn it into the A4, which was a single-seater, and they would strip down quite a bit of framework and armor, removing plating. They would also shorten these engine nacelles. That was to lighten it up, to make it a little faster, a little more maneuverable. Also easier for Rebel techs to work on in a pinch. So, basic specs were at about 16.25 meters long, about 8.5 meters wide. Standard crew of 1, although some variants could still seat 2. Max speed in an atmosphere was only about 1,000 kph. The hyperdrive was upgraded to a Class 1 though, and the original B version carried a total of 12 proton torpedoes in 2 tubes. This version often just carried 8 in 2 tubes to kind of save on weight a little bit. Alternatively, it could carry proton bombs or other missiles. It still had shielding, still had actually pretty good targeting systems, and it had long-range sensors. The weaponry, it either had 2 IX-4 or two KX-5 laser cannons in the front fixed forward, and it had two turreted light ion cannons up here. In the two-seat version, that would be controlled by the gunner. Often in the single-seat version, they were just locked forward. It also had an astromech to navigate and help keep things going. The rebellion really relied on these heavily early on. They were dependable, durable. They were at the Battle of Scarif, where several were lost. Gold Squadron was at, of course, the Battle of Yavin, where out of 8 there, only 1 survived, 3 of which were actually shot down by Vader himself, which is a little ironic considering Anakin piloted one of these during the Clone Wars. And while they were scheduled to be replaced by newer models around 3 ABY, the Battle of Hoth kind of put a stall on that, and because these were dependable in a known quantity, they kept them going through Endor, where they served, and Jakku and beyond. But after, luckily it's diecast, didn't matter. After the New Republic was formed, most of these were retired either to reserve forces or kind of again handed off to planetary defense or just mothballed in general. And this one here is from the old Titanium series. So you get the moving turret. Some had an opening canopy, this one doesn't. They do have landing gear that drop down. Kind of neat. And they are very heavy, chunky metal. I also have a version of this in the De Agostini line, which is kind of neat. It actually has these fully skeletonized, not just blacked out, but oh well. Didn't feel like digging everything out today. The Y-Wing was, of course, in A New Hope, and was kind of meant to be a stripped-down, hot rod, kind of chop job ship. Interestingly, originally was meant to have a bubble turret, kind of a la World War II, but they were having a hard time making that work with the blue/green screen of the day, so they ended up kind of going with the cockpit and remote turret that we see here. But yeah, everyone thinks of the X-Wing, but the Y-Wing was right there with it at the very, very beginning, and we see it throughout the original trilogy and its ancestor in the Clone Wars and its slightly upgraded successor in the Resistance. Now, I said I would not go into the Clone Wars too deeply, but I couldn't help but include this one, the Z95 Headhunter. And this was originally designed by Subpro with assistance from Incom, but during the Clone Wars, Incom took over full production rights. Now, this isn't a newfangled design. In fact, it first appeared in references in comics as far back as 1979, was in the Timothy Zahn books in the early 90s, was in the various video games. It's been in the universe a very long time, and in pretty much every iteration it's mentioned as being kind of the predecessor to the X-Wing. This version here from the Titanium series is the Clone Wars variant. And whereas the Y-Wing was a bomber/assault craft, this was always intended to be a Starfighter patrol ship. And for its day and time, because the design actually is before the Clone Wars, it was pretty advanced. It was at a time before a lot of things were standardized. It's about 11.5 meters long, lighter weight. We have twin-linked KX-5 laser cannons. Some variants could be fitted with a single ion cannon underneath as well. And it had concussion missile racks under the wings, each with 3 and a little launching thing, which is kind of neat. They were reasonably fast at about 1150 kph in atmosphere. Initially, they did not have a hyperdrive, but later versions would get one. Same goes for an astromech. Some would end up with an astromech, but a lot never did, so the jumps had to be pre-programmed. They couldn't be programmed in flight. Like an X-Wing, they had 4 engines in the back, giving them quite good maneuverability. They could, of course, land. And again, it's just kind of been a fan favorite, and it was nice that they brought them into the Clone Wars, which makes perfect sense. So these were used by the Republic before the Clone Wars a little bit, but they really came about when the clone variant was made during the wars, and then afterwards they were just kind of everywhere. Very standard ship, maybe not super remarkable, but it had shielding, if a bit light. It had sensors, if maybe mostly just short range, but it was very modular and upgradable. And so the Rebellion had quite a few of these. A lot of independent operators that joined the Rebellion also flew these. And sometimes they were used as auxiliary ships, like I said, in Bosk's ship. He had one as a kind of escape craft. Yeah, but it was kind of very standard ship. Not remarkable, but well-known, sturdy, kind of the Toyota of its day and time. But along with the ARC 170, this is where the INCOM kind of design aesthetic really gets going. And this is again from the Titanium series. It's quite nice. Has landing gear, has an opening canopy. It's pretty much all metal except for the guns. I like it. I've always kind of liked the Z95. What do you think? With that, let's move on to yet another early ship in the Rebellion. We come to the fastest ship in the Rebel fleet, the A-Wing Interceptor. And we have 2 versions here. And we'll begin with the R-22, so-called Spearhead. Now, this design actually began at Kuat Drive Yards, and it was kind of the intended successor or replacement for the Delta 7 series, the original Jedi Starfighters, and it was presented to the Empire not long into its reign, around 1516 BBY. But again, even though it was small and quick, it didn't really suit what they were doing, so they rejected it. Now, Kuwait had made a batch of them, not huge, but not tiny. And so a third party, the planet Tamazan, I believe, bought them and put them in to service as patrol ships, planetary defense vessels, escort ships, interceptors. And I'm sure you can understand how from there they ended up in Rebel hands in relatively small numbers, but we see them in Rebels. And it's said that at least 2 of these were at the Battle of Yavin in 0 BBY. These were very quick little ships. They had 2 RG-9 laser cannons. They also were fitted with concussion missile launchers, or at least they could be, in the wings. They had some long-range and short-range sensor packages, but they were very stripped down. They did have shielding, but it wasn't terribly heavy. They did have armor, but very little. They were meant to be quick. That was their deal. So they had 2 large, chunky engines. And while they had a hyperdrive, because there was no astromech, they had only a 2-jump limit. So the original R-22 was manufactured by Kuwait, and a handful would see service in the Rebellion early on. But that would actually lead to the A-Wing we have known and loved since Return of the Jedi. The A-Wing was about 7 meters long, just a little short or a little longer depending on which exact variant, and roughly 4.5 meters wide, although its thickness changed a little bit between the R-22 and the RZ-1. This one, by the way, is from the newer Hot Wheels because of it being from Rebels. But here we have a titanium from the original set, just the good old A-Wing. So, after the R-22, and obviously they didn't have more, they would start retrofitting some of them and building others kind of in underground workshops with some assistance from what was left of Incom to make the RZ-1 here. And essentially they just put bigger engines in it. And it was able to get up to 1300 kph in an atmosphere. We still have Class 1 hyperdrive. They now standardized the concussion missile launchers and expanded them to hold up to 6 missiles per side. That's why the body's a little thicker. It's a little bit of a squatter, fatter design, a little more going on. It actually has a pretty powerful sensor jammer integrated. Actually, the power for it's tied directly into these massive engines. It also can carry chaff and flare because this was designed to be a true interceptor. It could outrun a TIE interceptor, whereas the R-22 is a little bit more balanced. This one was much geared towards that purpose. It was also sometimes used as a long-range scout, and these guns could rotate. Some sources say 60 degrees, others say 360. Here they seem to want to go the 60. Either way, you have gimbaling guns a little bit. But this was just a very stripped down, simple ship, and since they were kind of made in underground workshops using whatever parts they had, they weren't 100% uniform, even sometimes using wood for parts of the interior. The earliest RZ-1s were available shortly after the Battle of Yavin and were in some limited service by Hoth, and one full squadron, Green Squad, was available for indoor. But again, they were kind of a hodgepodge craft, and while they were a very good interceptor, they compromised a lot. They were not terribly balanced. They couldn't take a hit. They were pretty maintenance intensive, especially because some of them were built by hand-fitting parts, and these big so-called Event Horizon engines were sometimes running a little hot. The A-Wing is interesting. In the real world, we first see this in Return of the Jedi, and originally in Legends it was said that this was developed after the Battle of Yavin, but as various materials, even in the Legends, started kind of inserting A-Wings in around Yavin, that's kind of where the R-22 comes from, and then when it appears in Rebels, it becomes solidified. There's also a 2-seat training version that could be used for light courier missions. Pretty cramped little cockpit in there. You basically just cram yourself in and hope for the best. Good field of view though. But you have another one from the Titanium series. Quite nice. They did these in several color schemes. I can't say it's my favorite fighter, but I like it. And it definitely does have a resemblance to the Delta 7. Well, I've teased you long enough. Like I said, this was kind of an extremist interceptor that compromised a whole lot. But our next fighter was just about as well-rounded as it gets. Alongside the Millennium Falcon and maybe the TIE Fighter and Star Destroyer, of course, the T-65 X-Wing is the most iconic Star Wars ship, certainly from the original trilogy. So we'll dive in a bit and give it an overview, but this is just going to be an overview. And got some examples here from the old titanium, the new, and from Hot Wheels. And let's begin with the Hot Wheels, because here we have the so-called concept X-Wing, part of their little concept series they did a few years ago, and it's pretty cool. Now, in universe, the T-65, as it was initially known, later the T-65A, was developed by Incom for the Republic/Empire. It was to replace not only the Z-95, but also the ARC-170. It had an integrated hyperdrive, 1 or 2 person cockpit, depending on which variant, 4 laser cannons. I believe initially they were the IX-4. But it really just wasn't what the Empire was going for. I think we kind of understand that. And that's what this concept model here, this is the kind of first X-Wing they thought of using in the show, in the movie. We have the 4 lasers. We have kind of this launcher above the cockpit that could be a turret or a ordnance launcher. We still have 4 engines in the back. Just more of an X shape. Now, this is a neat model. It's nice that they did it, but the problem is when the wings fold in, it gets kind of off-center for the canopy. You can see here it's kind of caca. Unfortunately, on this scale, there's going to be a compromise with the collapsing wings we'll get to with some further models. But when it's fully out, it looks pretty neat. So when Incom didn't get the contract from the Empire, they weren't terribly happy, but, you know, what was really the tipping point is when word was leaked that the Empire was about to nationalize them, i.e. take over, kind of like they did with Lando in Cloud City. So they accidentally let some prototypes of the X-Wing slip to the Rebellion, and then once the Rebellion was really on full speed after about 2 BBY, more slipped, including some of the designers and the blueprints. So the original T-65 or T-65A here gave way to a product improved version, the T-65B, the X-Wing that we all know and love. So here also from Hot Wheels we have the X-Wing as seen in Rogue One. That's kind of a pre-battle of Yavin, meaning it's an early B. Interestingly, it doesn't seem to have, well, there's a little bit of a dome for an astromech, but I can't tell if it's meant to be there or not. Now this is a fixed little model. The wings don't move, no landing gear, it's just what it is, little die-cast X-Wing. This version had a Class 1 hyperdrive, had an astromech, at least it could. They gave it up to 10 jump memory, plus they could calculate on the fly with the astromech. Had a crew of 1. It had 4 lasers, either IX-4s or the KX-9 type, and they could be linked in a few different fashions, so they were kind of flexible. It had 2 ordnance launchers, each capable of holding 3 proton torpedoes. They could hold other things, but it required some kind of fancy re-engineering, so they were designed for proton torpedoes. In the rear, it had a chaff and flare dispenser as kind of countermeasures. It had reasonably good shielding, reasonably good armor, reasonably good sensors, and a very good targeting computer. It only had 6 torpedoes, so I had to make them count. It said that the computer was up to 98% reliable. Overall length, a little bit bigger than the Z95 at about 12.5 meters. And with the S-foils collapsed in, cruising mode, it was just about 11 3/4 meters wide. So a little bit wider, a little bit longer, but basically the same profile as the Z95. Heavier ship, about the same speed as the Z95 in atmosphere, 1150 to 1200 kph. So you're not really getting an advantage there, but you're getting a lot more on board. And it was reasonably reliable. They, again, could operate from ground or space. It could fight in atmosphere, okay, but it was really meant to be a space superiority, multi-role space fighter, starfighter, kind of like an F-16. That might be an insult to some, but you get the drift. And this one here from Hot Wheels is pretty neat. Let me show you why. Here we have an earlier titanium, and it has fixed open S-foils as well, and at first looks pretty good. Has landing gear, opening canopy. It's mostly metal, but the problem, the guns. They're actually kind of on the outside of the wings, pointing almost inward, just the wrong positioning. Plus they have a propensity on this one, they're just slotted in, see? So they like to come off, which, you know, if you don't lose them is fine, they peg in. You can always glue them, but the way they're mounted is just not quite right. And of course they're fixed open. Also the engines have a lot of here and here where the top stick out more than the bottom. In reality, the bottom might stick out, the top might stick out a little bit more, but a little extreme on this one. Still, nevertheless, these were inexpensive and pretty neat for the day and time, and represented the Star Wars. But then they would, quote-unquote, improve the titanium with this version. So here's kind of the second style. So the S-foil's closed, the guns are on the right spot of the wing, but this middle part flips around. When you have the wings open, it doesn't. That's just kind of the slack built in. So you do get moving S-foils and the guns correctly, which is all in all an improvement. Still have opening canopy. Hello. By the way, these had ejection systems, which people debated how that exactly worked for the Rebels for decades. And yeah, the guns still kind of pop off. But again, you can glue them if it's a big deal. But because of the way it is, it's a little bit flimsier feeling when it's collapsed in. Of course, if it's just sitting on a shelf, it's not such a big deal. And it's an X-Wing, and they've made several paint jobs and whatnot of this craft. So which style do you prefer? The kind of fixed wing Hot Wheel, or the fixed wing titanium, or the later titanium with the moving S-foils? Let me know in the comments. But yeah, this can use its own full video for sure. It's just the ship. Of course, Red Squad, later Rogue Squad, being the most famous. We see these at Yavin, we see them at Hoth, we see them at Endor, and of course they would be at subsequent battles, and they would improve upon it from there. It's just a very iconic ship, and whereas kind of the Y-Wing, the designers were able to have fun with it in the real world, this one was more scrutinized because it was meant to be a hero ship. And while it was an Incom design, it ended up kind of being worked on by Underground Alliance Workshops, Rebellion, all that good stuff. But it would remain the frontline space superiority fighter for decades to come, or at least future versions of it. But it wasn't the final Incom design to go into Rebel service. We do have one more, which is also the newest one, at least as far as design, on the table. The UT-60D U-Wing. course, this was introduced in Rogue One, which inserts it prior to the Battle of Yavin. And the in-universe lore is that this is pretty much the final INCOM design before they were nationalized. They had made one production batch, and Bail Organa arranged for them to be lost and discovered by the rebels. So they had one batch of these. Now this isn't a traditional fighter. It is a support craft, a utility craft, a transport. Pretty neat though. With the S-foils, or wings forward, we're at about 24 meters long. So pretty long. But it's pretty slim. It's just over 8.5 meters wide. Meaning it can fit in bays. And it has the traditional 4 engines in the back we see for INCOM. And these S-foils do move. This one here is from the new, although I guess now it is also defunct, Titanium Black series. Fold back like that, and of course they're multi-positional. We have twin KX-7 lasers in the front. And this model they kind of delve in. They do have some pivot to them. Additionally, it can support 2 door gunners with heavy blasters or ion cannon, because again this is kind of based on the Black Hawk. You can also think the Huey, but more the Black Hawk. It has a cockpit with pilot and co-pilot. It can have the 2 optional door gunners, and on top of that it can carry 8 armed troopers. So again, very close to what the Black Hawk can do. It's not especially fast at about 950 kph in atmosphere, so a little slower than a Y-wing, but it's a much larger craft. It does have good shielding. It does have decent armor. It does have a Class 1 hyperdrive. And whereas most of the ones we've looked at today can operate independently for about a week on their own supplies, consumables, this has enough for 2 weeks. So it carries enough food, oxygen, water, fuel, what have you, for longer duration missions. Now this is the one here, like I said, from the Black Series Titanium. We also have one from the Hot Wheels series. Same basic style, but they did it differently. No opening canopy on this one. The guns in the front are fixed, but the wings still do move. And I actually like the wings on this better. They kind of click into position, unlike the other one, and they're not hollow on the bottom. If you look at the Black Series, they're just kind of hollow plastic a bit with the form. These seem a little better to me. Plus the screw hole's more recessed, which is something I've said about the Hot Wheels versus the Titanium Black Series before too. Either way, both kind of neat, both about the same price. Kind of funny that there were 2 competing lines at the same time during Rogue One. So they, like I said, had a handful of these at least 1 year before the Battle of Yavin. They were used heavily and quite successfully at the Battle of Scarif, although several were lost. At least one was reported to be stationed at Yavin Base, although this wasn't something you would send against the Death Star. Well, unless you wanted it to die. And they continued to see some limited use as transports and long-range vehicles during the time of Hoth, and at least 2 or 3 were at Endor, and they were used to try to salvage Star Destroyers, do boarding operations, and support missions. And I remember in Star Wars we don't have transporters, so yeah. And at least a couple were still around a year later for the Battle of Jakku, meaning that they made the most out of the handful that they had. I guess it's kind of a 2-deck system. You have your pilot and co-pilot kind of up top, and then bottom down here you have your troops and potential gunners. I like the design. Like a lot of, like I said, see, they kind of satisfyingly snap into place. Like a lot of the Rogue One designs, kind of elongated. There's definitely an aesthetic to that is unique to Rogue One. Whereas these, they just kind of fold. They're stiff, they're not floppy on this one, but they just fold up. And I'm going to say the Hot Wheels is a little heavier too. On the other hand, this one does have an opening canopy for what it's worth. And does have, I believe, yeah, there's a landing gear that pops down, so moving parts versus that. And I kind of like the Hot Wheels style better. That's just me though. So a nice addition to the Rebel fleet, and it makes sense because this does something. It's not a bomber, it's not an interceptor, it's not a multi-role fighter. It's a helicopter. It's a support craft. And considering the Rebels' style of strike operations, something they would definitely use. The ASF-01 B-Wing, also known as something that will not stand on its own on this carpet. Oh well. Have two here again, Hot Wheels and titanium. Let's start with the titanium. This one actually will stand, sort of, but it's on its stand very loosely. Always has been. Also known as the Blade Wing, this was the heaviest, most advanced starfighter the Rebels had. And there's a lot going on here. Now, between our Legends and canon, the origins have been changed up a bit. In Legends, this was developed shortly after Yavin, as the Empire was increasing its fight against Starfighters, and the Rebels were needing better blockade busters. And the new canon, this was designed shortly before the Battle of Yavin, with the B6 being the first prototype. In either way, the Korra or the Mon Cal, especially Akbar, tend to be involved, and it definitely has kind of their look. In Legends, Slan and Corporal, the designers of the V-19, worked in secret alongside Akbar and other Mon Cal to design this. And it was designed as an assault fighter, a bomber to replace the Y-Wing, a long-range escort, what have you. When it's folded up like this, it's less than 5 meters deep, but it's nearly 17 meters long, meaning that, yeah, kind of like with the U-Wing, it'll fit in a bay, but it will take up a lot of space in one direction. Of course, in flight mode, the S-foils expand out. And the cockpit rotates. One thing about the titanium here is the cockpit freely rotates 360 degrees. The whole thing would kind of gimbal, which gave interesting side effects to the pilots. But it was well fitted. Starting in the rear, we have 4 engine nozzles. And it was designed, because it was designed for the Rebellion, to be able to take a myriad of power plants, including 1 engine from a small cruiser or 4 fighter engines. It also had a lot of nav systems, electronic countermeasures, sensors that were really suited for a small capital ship. Here in the main fuselage, it has 2 ordnance launchers, each capable of holding 6 proton torpedoes or 4 heavy proton torpedoes. Has room in the cockpit for 1. The cockpit can eject to act as a lifeboat, much like the Y-Wing before it. There's even a small thruster on the back. But the trade-off is there's not room for an astromech, so it has a 2 jump limit, much like the A-Wing. We do have a number of weapons emplacements. There's a heavy emplacement on the bottom, and 2 lighter ones on each wing, and then a light emplacement under the canopy. And they could fit these out with various lasers and ion cannons. For example, we often saw it with 3 SW7 light ion cannons sometimes 1 or 2, maybe even 3 R9X heavy lasers, and sometimes smaller rapid fire blasters. The whole design was meant where you could take these off and swap it out on the fly. Again, it had a very good targeting computer. It was nominally faster than the Y-Wing, but since it is a pretty heavy ship, it was still slower than an X-Wing. And in atmosphere, it definitely had a lot of drag because this is not aerodynamic. But it had very good shielding and armor. Of course, the flip side, it was relatively expensive to make, and it was notorious for being labor and maintenance intensive. So yeah, this is our titanium. Pretty neat. These do fold. Like I said, the canopy rotates all the way around. These were said to be in limited service before Hoth, and at least 3 squadrons were available during Indoor, and they were credited with destroying at least as many Star Destroyers. So what about our Hartwell's example? Also known as the one that won't stand up. When it's on a level, hard surface, it's fine. It plugs in differently in the back. And these do not fold. The canopy does actually have a rotational stop, so orienting it properly is actually quite easy. See? From this side it looks pretty good. From this side we do have the screw holes. Oh well, what should technically be the bottom. Whereas, you know, our version here, it's a little cleaner. I do like how they did the canopy on the Hot Wheels, but all in all, I do think the titanium is just a better looking version. Yeah, this was always one of my favorite ships as a kid, although I never had the toy from Kenner. When it was in production for Return of the Jedi, they had yet again blue screen troubles, kind of like they had with the Y-Wing early on in A New Hope. So that's why you don't see as many B-Wings in the Indoor fight as you would like, as they would have liked. But it was still nevertheless there. We even got a B-Wing pilot for the Kenner line. So that's neat. And it's just a different looking fighter / bomber. And I always like different. It's definitely thinking outside of the box. By the way, the name B-Wing, you can justify it by saying B. Really though, it's just because they named it A fighter and B fighter in production for the A-Wing and the B-Wing. It wasn't because of their shapes, it's just kind of the code names or the, you know, the shorthand the crew used, and it just kind of stuck with A-Wing and B-Wing after Y-Wing and X-Wing. By the way, the name X-Wing was said out loud in Empire Strikes Back by the by the Imperial officer, and it was actually in the script for A New Hope anyway, so definitely canon. I don't know if Y-Wing was ever said until the Clone Wars, though. But I really do like the B-Wings. And they would somewhat refine the design after the end of the Civil War. But this would remain the major escort, long-range escort, and assault craft for many years to come. And it definitely has a Mon Cal look about it, I think. What do you think? Yeah. So flat, but so long. Okay, so we've covered the Starfighters of the Rebellion, but I want to end by looking at the ones from the New Republic. Even if we may not care for the sequel trilogy much, the designs don't turn me off, although I do like the TIE Fighters there better. That said, what we have does fit in nicely for kind of a second generation. The original BT LA4 was a hot-rodded, stripped-down version of a Clone Wars era fighter bomber. Well, after the New Republic was established, Conseil reconsolidated under a new company, and since the Y-Wing was pretty famous for being one of the backbones of the rebellion, they reintroduced the basic framework and design, and we got the BTA NR2, NR for New Republic 2, Y-Wing. And these were inexpensive to produce, and it was a known design. They just did some things like they updated the sensor package, the targeting package, with newer technology. They gave it more powerful shielding. Sorry, this is very tight. And slightly more updated power plant. And they kind of returned to the original BTLB design with the longer engines and a little more armor. It's about 18 meters long, about 4.7, 4.8 meters wide, so slightly longer, slightly wider, a little bit heavier. Originally we had an upgraded version of the lasers known as the IX-4B. Later these would be replaced by the IX-8. We also had a slightly more powerful ion cannons and a bubble turret. These were designed with the original B. They were controlled by a gunner. With the A4 over here, they're usually fixed forward or remote controlled. These were designed from the outset to be remote controlled or controlled by the astromech, so that the pilot didn't have to worry about it. This was designed from the outset to be less of a bomber and more of a long-range patrol peacekeeping craft. It did have more powerful engines. Still wasn't super fast in an atmosphere, about 1050, 1100 kph. But it had a good Class 1 hyperdrive, better sensors, more advanced electronic countermeasures, and was overall a more capable and very cost-effective update, kind of Generation 3 of a classic design. Kind of think of it like the newer F-16s, the Ds, or even newer variants. That aircraft is quite long in the tooth. And we actually saw this in the real world in Episode 9, and it's definitely not a huge departure from the original over here, but I don't hate it. I do like that it has the longer engines again. It's a pretty neat little model from Hot Wheels. By this point, the Black Series is gone, so we got Hot Wheels. Nothing moves on it, but that's okay. Oh, and a lot of the times when this was in the peacekeeping role, because of disarmament treaties, it wasn't fitted with ordnance, but it could be retrofitted with 2 ordnance launchers, again, each carrying up to 6 proton torpedoes, or it could carry up to 20 proton bombs, kind of like the original. But mostly it was just a long-range defense and patrol and policing, anti-piracy, anti-smuggling craft. I don't mind it. It's nice to see the Y-Wing still strutting about, doing its wishbone thing. Next up, the second generation of A-Wing, which makes perfect sense. As I said earlier, the RZ-1 was kind of made with whatever materials they had access to, in chop shops, wherever they could do it. So even before the New Republic was fully entrenched, right after Endor, the Mark II version, soon to be renamed the RZ-2, was put into production, and it was a standardized version made at full factories with standard components, and it was kind of combining a lot of the lessons learned from fielding the RZ-1 here. And I do like the look of this craft, and it does a little bit harken back to the R-22 a bit. It's a little longer at about 7.5, 7.6 meters, whereas the other one was a little under 7. It's also slightly wider at about 4.6, 4.7 meters. But it's very flat. It's very slick, very streamlined. And that was done not only to make it look better, but also to improve handling, make it easier on the pilots to fly. They also made these vanes in the back, the verticals, movable. They can kind of gimbal in an atmosphere especially, to provide a little more responsiveness and, frankly, forgiveness to the pilot. We're still using versions of the Event Horizon engines. They are slightly improved, giving it a better top speed of about 1350 kph in atmosphere, but because of other changes in the new body, it's even more maneuverable, while at the same time, like I said, being a little easier to fly. They improve the sensor package. They improve the jamming package, giving it updated avionics. Also, much like with the improved Y-wing, they gave it a more modern control interface in the cockpit. They updated the lasers slightly so they could rotate up to 360 degrees, at least some variants. And they made the ordnance launchers very much a standard feature, each holding up to 6 concussion missiles. And a new feature with the Mark II, it could actually hold micro or mini proton torpedoes. This is still very much an interceptor, but since it could carry both missiles and torpedoes, and since the shields were also strengthened, this actually became the main starfighter of the young New Republic. It was cheap to build, could be piloted by one person without an astromech. So by 7 ABY, just a couple of years after the New Republic, this was their primary starfighter. And it was still being built and certainly used up till about 30 ABY, although it was getting a bit long in a tooth at that time. But I actually do like this one. In a lot of ways, it's a lot sleeker. Looking at the original A-Wing, it is a little bulbous. This is very aerodynamic looking. Yeah, this might be one of the few I actually like the newer version more than the original, but again, the A-Wing was never my favorite to begin with. What do you think? And since the A-Wing was relatively new during the Civil War, it makes perfect sense that it'd still be in service somewhere 20, 30 years later. And this one from Hot Wheels is just pretty much entirely metal, which is quite nice. We first see this in The Last Jedi, everyone's favorite film that's not at all controversial. But of course, I save the most interesting talking point to last. We end where we should, with an X-Wing, the T-70. The prototype for this design was actually developed shortly after Endor and was ready for service before the final defeat of the Empire, although it wasn't put into mass full-scale production by Incom Freitech until around 5-6 ABY. Like I said, the RZ-2 is kind of the primary starfighter. This was designed to be a smaller, more flexible version of the T-65 over here. It's not a lot smaller. We've got two versions here from Hot Wheels, closed and open. Let's look at the closed first. It's an older one. It's a little under 12.5 meters long, so slightly shorter than the T-65. And it's not much more than 11 meters wide, so a little bit shorter there. And it was just designed to be slimmer and more efficient. It has pretty much the same systems, although it has updated sensors, updated countermeasures, electronics. It has updated engines. It's slightly faster, kind of like we've seen all around. It uses the KX-12 laser cannons as opposed to the 9s before. One improvement they made was it has kind of a modular system. Essentially, it has hard points under the wings where you can mount ordnance launchers or what have you, including additional laser cannons. So that's kind of a neat feature. And of course, the design itself is inspired by the original X-Wing prototype, where they have these cylinders that split in two when the S-foils are open. I can tell I haven't had this one off the stand much because it was very stiff. When the wings are open, those cylinders split in two. Not sure how practical that is, but it's a thing they wanted to do. Although it is interesting how the wings, the S-foils, kind of overlap each other. Doot, doot, doot. So when they fold in, they're actually quite a bit slimmer versus our original style over here. So a little sleeker overall. I would say that, yeah, the major updates was the fact that it can have modular weapons stowed under the wings, or even modular bays, because while the T-65 was a great multi-role fighter, it pretty much was focused on proton torpedoes. This could definitely fire them, but it was designed to much more easily take other ordnance like mag pulses, concussion missiles, and the like, just making it more versatile. And again, a little bit better speed, updated lasers, updating targeting systems. Still a Class 1 hyperdrive. The shielding is, again, improved a bit. So along with the A-Wing, this was kind of the front line. Kind of like how the U.S. had the F-15 and F-16 in service together. Or for a time, the F-14 and the F-A-18. It's always good to have multi-purpose things. This one was more skewed towards the bomber, and the A-Wing was more skewed towards being an interceptor. And for 2 decades, this would remain the premier Starfighter. But in the 20s ABY, it was starting to show its age, and the fact that it was a little smaller, a little lighter, and wasn't necessarily designed for wartime as much as peacetime operations. It meant that many, like Admiral Lightbar, wanted something bigger and better again. And for this, I thought I would compare the folding versions of each. Of course, I'm talking about the T-85, which I don't really have a version of. For some reason, they never really made it, but it looked pretty much the same. It's an X-Wing. But it was bigger, about 15 meters long and about 13 meters wide, so bigger than even the T-65. And it was kind of a return to form. It had more of a fixed proton rack and heavier shielding armament, just a bigger ship. It was the frontline starfighter for the New Republic. The prototype was ready in 26 ABY, and by 30 ABY it was in frontline service. That's how the Resistance ended up with the older T-70s. But of course, many of the T-85s were lost when things went kaboom. So I thought we'd end by kind of comparing the folding versions here, because I've seen it repeated that the newer Black Series is kind of cheaper feeling, and in some ways I agree, some I don't. As I pointed out earlier, I'm not 100% happy with this. It's fine when it's open, but it does drop guns, as just illustrated. Again, I probably should just glue these, because they just get worse and worse as years go on. They probably should have pegged them in a little better. But again, it's better than breaking off. But yeah, the way they open, it definitely feels a little wigglier than the fixed version. But I do like that the guns are placed properly. And it does have landing gear. So we've already looked at the Hot Wheels T-70. Here is the Black Series Titanium T-70. It too has the wiggly center, and it too does have an opening canopy, which is kind of neat. And it does have landing gear on the underside, so very similar. And it too has the opening wings. And the guns are more permanently affixed here, which will be good unless you break them. Both wings are plastic. These are a thinner plastic. But when it's open, the centerpiece is not wiggling at all. And it actually kind of snaps open with a little more authority than the old titanium. What I'm getting at is, even if this does feel a little beefier, it just doesn't stay open as well, and the guns fall off. So there's kind of pros and cons to each. This one is slightly heavier than this one, but I was actually kind of pleasantly surprised. I lost another gun. I'm going to glue those. I was actually surprised, based on how people were trash talking these, how decent they were. Now, a kid would break it in a heartbeat, but these wings and the whole ship is just thinner, so it's just going to be a more svelte design anyway. I still prefer the original X-Wing, but I don't hate this version. I do like how the wings fold together, making one flat wing. That is kind of cool. I'm not going to lie. And the guns line up. By the way, the T-85 had outdated laser cannons, KX-14s, more powerful. Again, it was just a beefed up version because they knew war was on the horizon. Yeah, the final X-Wing. We'll just say that Landro threw this through the Death Star and knocked off some bits, right? Again, we still have astromechs. Still doing jump calculations. You think they could just hardwire a brain in one of these and kind of get around that, don't you? But, oh well. No, I like it. But I still think the Hot Wheels version of just doing an open and a closed is probably better. And besides, that means Hot Wheels can then sell you 2 ships instead of 1. This is, of course, the Platinum Collector's series that I got a couple years ago as a gift. And this one's on that stupid early flight stand. But it is kind of neat. I do like the closed version. Very sleek. And this Resistance, what do they call it? Or Insurgents, I forget what they call it from Rogue One. I do like that it's the earlier pattern T-65. Although I do wish someone would do a T-85 just for fun. Let me know if anyone has. And those, dear viewers, are my Rebel/New Republic starships. Let's bring it back to home one. Well, I hope this was a kind of fun and relaxing video for the holidays, covering the different ones. I didn't want to go too deep into the Clone Wars for pretty obvious reasons, and really couldn't help but, have the Resistance ships in because they're just slight modifications. Although they fit in well as kind of second generations of these ships, I don't really think they're all that inventive, but they would work in other situations. So let me know what you think. What's your favorite? X-Wing, kind of the standard. Maybe the Y-Wing or the B-Wing or the A-Wing, or maybe you like the new U-Wing. Let me know. Let's discuss below. Hope everyone's having a good holiday season. This is Misha. Catch you very soon next time.